Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, try luck, I wish I'd find. Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Okay, working on some technical difficulties here, and my captions are still not goddamn working. Ugh. Frustrating. Alright, well, I'm not going to mess with them right now. We'll just... I don't even know why they're showing up suddenly. Go away. There we go. Alright. They're not working, so why have them there? Alright, so we're on part 4 of 48 Liberal Lies about American history that you probably learned in school. So where are we up to? We're on lie number 8. So let's see how long it is. We'll kind of get an idea of how many we're going to do tonight. It's 1, 2, 3, it's 5 pages. So a 9 is 4 pages. And then 4 pages for number 10. So I'll try to get through 8, 9, and 10 tonight. All right, here we go. Lie number 8. Ronald Reagan knew Star Wars wouldn't work, but wanted to provoke a war with the USSR. That's the lie. All right. 3 quotes to begin with, just like usual. Well, they're not always 3, but anyway. Although funded by Congress, SDI was a long way from reality in 1983. Critics convinced SDI was science fiction, called the plan Star Wars. That is by Gene Boydston et al., Making a Nation. The second quote. But even as the Pentagon launched an SDI research program, critics pointed out not only the project's prohibitive cost and technological implausibility, but also the likelihood that it would further escalate the arms race. That one is by Paul S. Boyer et al. From The Enduring Vision. And then the third one, nicknamed Star Wars after a popular science fiction film, it spent billions of dollars trying to establish a space-based defense system. Most scientists contended that the project was as fantastic as the movie. And that's by James West Davidson et al. From Nation of Nations. And you think about it, you're talking about 1983, I believe. Let's see, when did Empire Strikes Back come out? Because I'm pretty sure Return of the Jedi was 85. So maybe the first 2 movies were out. Definitely the first one was, but I don't remember. Anyway, tangent. Moving on into the lie, into his explanation here. Probably no lie is taken for granted more in college textbooks than the notion that Star Wars won't work, quote unquote. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had early anti-missile systems in place in the late 1960s, but these were virtually eliminated with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1969. Still as early as the 1970s, the Soviet Union was engaged in serious experimentation with laser beams and particle beams weapons for the purpose of use in space. Throughout the decade, both U.S. Air Force Special Investigations teams and the Central Intelligence Agency tracked Soviet experiments with beam technologies. What was holding them back, however, was a severe dearth of computer technology, the kind of technology provided by the American private sector in the form of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak's Apple personal computer, introduced in 1976. Computing technology in the 1970s underwent a transformation from giant Cray-type supercomputers used in the Pentagon to the possibility of thousands of personal workstations spread across the nation. At the same time, advances in military radars, tracking, and targeting meant that intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, could be identified and tracked from space and, if necessary, destroyed. While none of this necessarily required laser beams, light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation, that's what it stands. The L is light, A amplification, S is the stimulated, E is emission, and R is radiation. So that's what laser stands for, in case you didn't know that. None of this necessarily required laser beams or charged particle beams. Both worked exceptionally well in space without the diffusion effects of Earth's atmosphere, and therefore seemed perfectly tailored to destroying ICBMs in flight. By 1983, when President Ronald Reagan made his renowned speech, most of the technologies were in place to destroy at least some incoming missiles in the event of an enemy attack. Reagan had always searched for a way to circumvent MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. Quote, almost as long as I have known him, Reagan was very interested in some sort of defense against missiles, ballistic missiles, and nuclear warfare, end quote, recalled former Chief of Staff Edwin Meese. Even as governor of California, Reagan discussed defenses against missiles with Caspar Weinberger, who would later be his Secretary of Defense. MAD was ridiculous in Reagan's mind and needed to be countered. Martin Anderson, a policy advisor to Reagan, recalled that his, quote, main concern was the threat of nuclear weapons and what we're going to do about it and how we're going to solve it, end quote. Reagan, Anderson noted, was determined to do, quote, something about what he used to call Armageddon, the threat of nuclear war, end quote. The president even commented to one advisor, Fred Ilke, that an automatic retaliatory missile launch upon the detection of Soviet missiles being fired at the United States would be wrong, and some advisors questioned whether he would order a retaliatory launch under any circumstances. Retaliatory. When George Keyworth, Reagan's science advisor, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Daniel Graham, began to investigate possibilities in the early 1980s, they concluded that off-the-shelf technologies alone could provide a measure of defense. All of this played out within Reagan's broader objectives in the Cold War, outlined in a National Security Council April 1982 paper released in 1996, that for the first time stated the U.S. goal was not just to contain the USSR, but to reverse its expansion. Among the numerous strategies to do this was to restrain or weaken Soviet military standing. In 1981, Reagan told a reporter that for the first time, the Soviets were, quote, going to be faced with the fact that we could go forward with an arms race and they can't keep up, end quote. The 1982 paper again emphasized the U.S. advantage in technology, and cited other internal studies showing rightly that the Soviet economy had slowed dramatically. These realities congealed in Reagan's mind as he ushered in a top-down initiative on strategic defense. As Reagan himself wrote, quote, SDI wasn't conceived by scientists, end quote. Indeed, it was only at Reagan's insistence that strategic defense started to become a routine part of military studies done by the Joint Chiefs. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane appreciated Reagan's direction, arguing that, quote, the Russians had such a high regard for American technology that you leverage their perceptions dramatically by an investment in high technology. You create expectations of discovery, end quote. Reagan made no outlandish promises, did not use the term laser beams, space weapons, and certainly not Star Wars. And in his diaries, he noted, quote, I made no optimistic forecasts, said it might take 20 years or more but we had to do it. I felt good, end quote. But he did understand, as he wrote in his diary in October 1986, that, quote, the Soviets, if faced with an arms race, would have to negotiate. They can't squeeze their people any more to try and stay even with us, end quote. In 1985, Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Contrary to the claims of most textbooks, it was not scientists who labeled the system Star Wars, but the press, in a deliberate attempt to ridicule it. But the Soviets took it quite seriously. Why, if it was so fantastic or just science fiction? The obvious answer was it was fantastic only in the sense that it very well might work, and it was far from science fiction. They knew, as did our own engineers, that the key to SDI was computers. We had them, the Soviets didn't. Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev said, quote, even now, due to computer technology, one side could get ahead in space, end quote. Although he pretended he, quote, did not know what lay at the bottom of the U.S. position, end quote, on SDI, Gorbachev acted very much like a man who knew exactly what American technology could do. Although he labeled it an illusion, quote unquote, Gorbachev, according to Reagan's Secretary of State George Shultz, made clear that his primary focus was to, quote unquote, stop the SDI program. At every meeting, Gorbachev was obsessed with SDI. At Reykjavik in 1985, Reagan employed his acting skills regarding Star Wars. When Gorbachev wanted language to kill SDI, Reagan refused. Gorbachev, quote, tried to act jovial, but I acted mad and it showed, end quote. The administration even added to the Soviets' paranoia by rigging an SDI test in 1984 to show success. Success, quote unquote. Before I go on, there is a photo and a caption. I'll read the caption first. It was the astounding precision of American technology represented by this Tomahawk cruise missile about to hit a target of a few inches in diameter after a flight of nearly 1,000 miles that terrified Mikhail Gorbachev. He knew that Star Wars could indeed work and would produce the capability to destroy Soviet ICBMs in flight. And there is the photo of the Tomahawk about to hit. Must have been just milliseconds before it struck. Okay. The question then has answered itself. Why would the Soviets worry in the least about a system that, quote unquote, wouldn't work? Indeed, why would you not urge your enemy to build such a system and divert or waste his money? The answer was it would work, and the Soviets knew it. As Andrew Bush put it, SDI threatened the Soviets, quote, with the choice of an unacceptable strategic defeat or an unacceptable technological and economic burden, end quote. By the late 1980s, the U.S. Air Force's Flying Laser Laboratory, quote unquote, showed it could shoot down 4 missiles in flight simultaneously, and in the Gulf War, modified Patriot anti-aircraft missiles demonstrated the capability to shoot down so-called terminal phase ICBMs by killing several of Iraq's Scud missiles. While the record of the earliest Patriot batteries was debated, the more recent PAC-2 anti-missile variants have proven extremely effective. An even more advanced PAC-3 version went operational in 2003. In 1992, space-based interceptors were successfully tested. As early as 1991, the Air Force, which had by then taken over most of the Office of Strategic Defense Initiative work, destroyed an ICBM using an interceptor missile launched almost 5,000 miles away in the Pacific Ocean. Another, in 2007, shot down a Scud-type missile in the final stages of flight. In 2007, numerous successful tests underscored the practicality of missile defense. New ground-based interceptors were demonstrated An interceptor fired by a destroyer killed a target missile, and the Aegis ballistic missile defense system went 3 for 3 in its test to destroy incoming warheads. The new Peace Through Light flying ray gun 747 airborne laser, capable of zapping enemy missiles during boost phase, was battling for its budget life, but it was a budgetary issue, not a technological question. By July 2007, the modified jet completed a key test that, quote, demonstrated most of the steps needed for the airborne laser to engage a threat missile, end quote. In September 2007, yet another successful test led General Victor E. Renourt Jr., commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, U.S. Northern Command, to state that the Star Wars system was ready to be used at any time. Quote, I'm fully confident that we have all the pieces in place that, if the nation needed to, we could respond to an incoming ballistic missile threat, end quote. Finally, in the spring of 2008, a Star Wars anti-missile missile shot down a satellite which was falling out of orbit and posing a threat to the U.S. population. Do you think any of the textbooks bothered to go back and revise their stunningly stupid predictions about Star Wars? Don't hold your breath. The technological questions had been answered. Star Wars worked and right on time. Reagan's 20-year estimate for the technology to mature was on target after all. As Jean-Francois Revel observed, quote, translating communism's economic disaster into political disaster required translators, end quote. Ronald Reagan was an excellent translator, and his language was Star Wars. And that is the end of that lie. So I had not heard about all of these tests in the 2000s. Totally went right past me. I never even heard about them. Okay. Lie number 9. Mikhail Gorbachev, not Ronald Reagan, was responsible for ending the Cold War. And again, we start with 3 quotes. So here goes. Gorbachev's reform policies led not only to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but also to the breakup of the Soviet Union itself. And that is by James West Davidson et al. From Nation of Nations. The next one is Gorbachev also backed off Soviet imperial ambitions. That's by George Brown Tyndall and David Emery Shee. America. A Native History. That okay, I get it. That's the whole title. The third is perhaps more important than Reagan. Under a new, younger leadership, the Kremlin allowing long dormant forces of change to emerge and drive the USSR toward democracy and a market economy. That's by David E. Harrell et al. From Unto a Good Land. And this one is, 4 pages, including what I just read. An oft-repeated position in many major U.S. history books is the notion that Mikhail Gorbachev ended the Cold War with his liberal reforms of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness in government. According to this view, Gorbachev wanted to move the government of the Soviet Union more toward a market economy, but by doing so, he unwittingly unleashed a revolution he could not control. Moreover, Gorbachev was not an imperialist in the tradition of his Stalinist predecessors. In short, according to this line of thinking, Gorbachev was a benign monarch whose changes made possible negotiations with the West. Even if such assessments were accurate, never mind that this great liberal kept a Soviet army in Afghanistan until high casualties forced him to withdraw, or that he supported the Cuban takeover of Grenada. they would still miss the essential point. Gorbachev was motivated by the new pressures put on him by Ronald Reagan. Even before he became president, Reagan Reagan intuitively knew that a communist system cannot sustain itself or provide for the basic necessities of its population. Once he entered the White House, Reagan received intelligence estimates that confirmed his instincts. Quote, the Soviet economy was being held together with baling wire. It was a basket case, end quote, he said. Less than 2 weeks after taking the oath of office, Reagan wrote in his diary, quote, trade was supposed to make the Soviets moderate. Instead, it has allowed them to build armaments. Their socialism is an economic failure. Wouldn't we be doing more for their people if we let their system fail instead of constantly bailing it out? End quote. He told a reporter that the first time the Soviets were, quote, going to be faced with the fact that we could go forward with an arms race and they can't keep up, end quote. Time and again, intelligence showed that the Soviet Union was on the brink of economic collapse. All it needed was a push, and Reagan intended to give it a shove. In early 1982, the Reagan administration issued a series of National Security Decision Directives, NSDDs, that spelled out in detail how the United States would bankrupt the Soviet Union. One line of attack was to reverse Soviet expansion throughout the world, the first time since 1946 that any president made it official U.S. policy to roll back the Soviet Empire, not contain it. Another emphasis was stopping the new Soviet gas and oil pipeline to Western Europe, thereby depriving the USSR of hard cash. It didn't take the Soviets long to figure out this new threat. Quote, you have declared war on us, economic war, end quote, said General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, Gorbachev's predecessor. Putting high-tech items such as computers, software, and testing equipment on the restricted lists, Reagan made it impossible for the USSR to stay abreast of the United States in advanced technologies. Reagan also authorized a remarkable strategy which even recently was not well known. While blocking the sales of high-tech equipment, Reagan approved CIA Director William Casey's plan to allow certain products to slip through the U.S. high-tech blockade. An initiative begun by a National Security Council staffer named Gus Wise, called the Farewell Dossier, leveraged the Soviets' organized effort to steal American technology by providing, quote, enticing new technologies, end quote, that would appear genuine but which would later prove destructive. One of these involved pipeline technology, which the Soviets swallowed hook, line, and sinker. Later, the technology passed its tests only to fail when it actually came online, severely retarding the Soviets' pipeline effort. Software to run the Soviet pumps, built to pass its tests, was secretly programmed to produce pressures that would burst the pipeline's tolerances. In 1982, a section of the pipeline failed, but it took 20 years for Wise or anyone else in the CIA to admit the secret embedding. In 1983, Soviet high-tech imports from the United States had fallen sevenfold, while customs agents dashed efforts to steal the technology by seizing more than 1,400 illegal shipments totaling $200 million. Without American technology, the Soviet economy fell further behind, at the very time it needed to surge ahead. Combined with the constricting impact on the cash flow from the slowed pipeline, the USSR was rapidly becoming a third world country. All of this presumed that Gorbachev would not cut back his military spending to support improvements in the lives of ordinary citizens, and the presumption proved correct. While the numbers are hotly debated, a general consensus is that Soviets spent between 25 and 40% of their gross domestic product on their military. The United States spent 5%. The, quote, great dynamic success of capitalism has given us a powerful weapon in our battle against communism, money, end quote, Reagan wrote. Then, so to speak, Reagan dropped, quote-unquote, the bomb. Having already secured an overall expansion of American weapon systems, including construction of the B-1 bomber, deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles, installation of 50 MX ICBMs, and construction of numerous new warships, Reagan stunned the Soviet leaders in 1983 with his Star Wars speech. I forgot about MX missiles. I used to have a T-shirt that said MX missile yes. When I was young enough, I didn't know what the hell it was about. I didn't. It was a missile, and I liked missiles. Um, the Gipper never wavered in his belief that the Strategic Defense Initiative could and eventually would really work. Writing in his diary after the speech, quote, "I made no optimistic forecast, but said it might take 20 years or more, but we had to do it," end quote. In the short term, however, the impact would be unmistakable. The Soviets would have to capitulate or drastically ramp up their military spending to counter Star Wars. Like a high-stakes poker player, Reagan worked every angle, approving a faked SDI test in June 1984 to further convince the Soviets that Star Wars was ahead of schedule. It worked. SDI was the Soviets' quote-unquote number one preoccupation, and Foreign Minister Alexander Bezmertnyk I don't know, said they were, quote, enormously frightened by SDI, end quote. It is well documented that the KGB tried with little impact to affect the 1984 U.S. presidential election in Walter Mondale's favor. At the same time, however, the Reagan administration exerted subtle pressure on the Kremlin to replace the deceased Soviet dictator Konstantin Chernenko with someone more sensible and, to use a buzzword of our day, moderate. More than a few observers have argued that Reagan's policies drove the Soviets to install a quote-unquote less dangerous Soviet leader, as Secretary of the Interior William Clark wrote. It's unarguable that Gorbachev was already working his way up the ranks of the communist leadership in the USSR, being named to the Politburo in 1980, before Reagan was even elected. But Yuri Andropov, who headed the KGB and who recognized that the hardliners were getting nowhere, supported Gorbachev as a better counterpart to Reagan than other existing candidates. Left-wing historian John Lewis Gaddis saw SDI as one of the factors that, quote, contributed to the rise of Gorbachev, end quote. Reagan's NSDDs also devised a strategy to bog down the Soviets in Afghanistan, sending Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the Afghan Mujahideen. Reagan evened the odds for the resistance and eventually forced the Soviet withdrawal. In NSDD 166, U.S. policy officially became to, quote, keep maximum pressure on Moscow for withdrawal, end quote, and to, quote, ensure that the Soviets' political, military, and other costs remain high while the occupation continues, end quote. Peter Rodman, a State Department official, and said the United States had a, quote, clear policy of seeking to defeat the Soviet Union and force a Soviet withdrawal, end quote. In 1980, candidate Reagan said that an arms race was the last thing the Soviets wanted to see from the United States. Quote, they know that if we turned our full industrial might into an arms race, they cannot keep pace with us. Why haven't we played that card, end quote. As president, the Gipper played that card. Across the board, using American banks and bullets, money and missiles, technology and diplomacy, the United States put a full court press on the Soviet Union. The best that can be said for Gorbachev was that he was open to defeat. In 1989, historian John Lewis Gaddis, once a stalwart of the New Left historians, conceded, quote, "The time has come to acknowledge an astonishing development. Ronald Reagan has presided over the most dramatic improvement in U.S.-Soviet relations and the most solid progress in arms control since the Cold War began," end quote. And that is the end of that one. Take those glasses off for a second. All right. So one more. Yeah, we're only 35 minutes in. Awesome. These go quick, but I'm only going to read one more. 3 is enough. And it is what? It's really only about 3 pages. All right. So lie number 10. We'll be just shy of a quarter of the way through this book. September 11th was not the work of terrorists. It was a government conspiracy. See, now, I think I'm going to disagree with him on this, at least in part. But, here we go. 2 quotes to start off. Did it sort of look like those buildings came down in controlled demolition? That's a quote from Charlie Sheen in 2006. And the next one is, "Don't ask me to tell you what happened on 9/11. All I know is that the official account of the building's collapse is improbable." That's by Paul Craig Roberts, from Gullible Americans, August 14th, 2006. Be interesting to see what he has to say here. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that it was a Frenchman, Thierry Mason, who first concocted the ridiculous mantra that the United States destroyed the Twin Towers and hit the Pentagon. Nor should it be surprising that his publisher specializes in titles such as "Moon Landings Did NASA Lie?" or "The Great Illusion, The Death of Adolf Hitler." It probably didn't even raise many eyebrows when The View's Rosie O'Donnell, one of the angriest of angry women, claimed that 9/11 was the, quote, "first time in history that fire has ever melted steel," end quote, and that, quote, "we don't know that it imploded," end quote, and that it, quote, "was an implosion and a demolition," end quote. I hate it when they do that. While O'Donnell has appeared unbalanced on many an occasion, some were surprised that actor Charlie Sheen, son of a left-wing activist, actor Martin Sheen, on the Alex Jones show said, quote, "It seems to me like 19 amateurs with box cutters taking over 4 commercial airliners and hitting 75% of their targets. That feels like a conspiracy theory. It raises a lot of questions," end quote. I don't see where he's wrong there. It does raise a lot of questions. Sheen, a reasonably solid actor, must have been driven mad by overexposure to the canned laugh tracks of 2.5 Men. Shortly after 9/11, seeing that President George W. Bush had responded magnificently to a terrorist attack on the nation, the Democratic Party sought to diminish the credit going to the president. In May 2002, on the floor of the U.S. Senate, Hillary Clinton waved a copy of that day's edition of the New York Post with its headline, "Bush Knew." The story claimed the president had been given a briefing warning of impending terrorist attacks. Quote, "The president knew what?" End quote, she asked. Quote, "My constituents would like to know the answer to that and many other questions." End quote. All that remained unsaid was that Mrs. Clinton's constituents wanted to know how fire could melt steel. The editors of the blue-collar magazine Popular Mechanics joined the fray by reviewing some of the conspiracy books before publishing Debunking 9/11 Myths in 2006. The airplanes carried some 10,000 gallons of jet fuel each. Jet fuel burns at 1100 to 1200 degrees Celsius, and steel doesn't melt until it reaches 1510 degrees Celsius, but it loses strength at 400 degrees Celsius, and at 980 degrees it possesses less than 10% of its strength. Load-bearing columns and beams did not need to melt. They only needed to be weakened and bent sufficiently. The National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, conducted a study of the building's collapse and found that the impact had stripped fireproofing insulation from trusses that supported 80,000 square feet of floor space, end quote. As floors began to sag, they put additional stress on the 90% weakened steel columns, pulling them inward and adding to the stress on surviving columns. None of this even begins to take into consideration the phenomenal impact stresses of a jetliner striking the buildings at over 150 miles per hour, or the quote-unquote hollowing out of the load-bearing elevator shafts by the fuel and fire that shot down them. Brigham Young University's Stephen Jones, in a paper called, quote, Why Indeed Did the World Trade Center Buildings Completely Collapse on 9/11/01, end quote, argued that the World Trade Center steel did not perform as models say it should. Jones and some others claim that thousands of pounds of high explosives placed inside the World Trade Center brought it down. Yet not a single witness reported any unusual movements of people, which actually is not true. They have reported it since then. Let alone dozens of people in black suits marching into the 80th to 105th floors of the buildings with thousands of pounds of explosives. More unbelievable are the absurd claims about the hundreds of people on board the airplanes who are, according to Peter Meyer and other conspiracy theorists, being detained at a government facility so they can't quote-unquote spill the beans. Another theory postulates that the passengers aren't listed as dead since the planes could have offloaded them at any of a number of military bases. Odd that there is no record of any of those jets being seen again, let alone landing. Of course, the families who heard from their loved ones, including the Solicitor General of the United States, Ted Olson, who heard from his wife Barbara before her plane hit the Pentagon, know what happened to the passengers. Others have claimed that missiles, not airplanes, brought down the towers, but this is easily refuted by the identification of aircraft parts that exited the buildings. Airplane parts carry identifying marks. Landing gear and engine parts specifically tied to the planes that hit the towers were recovered. Well, say the conspiracy theorists, quote, the planes were real, but they weren't passenger planes. They were special military airplanes, end quote. From the quote-unquote military pod to the quote-unquote absence of windows on one or all of the airplanes, the entire argument is preposterous. It denies the eyewitnesses who saw the planes take off and the crews that boarded them. It denies A, the witnesses that saw them board and take off, and B, the radar data that tracked them, and C, the dozens of passengers who called from all the airplanes, not only on cell phones, which indeed can operate at the altitudes the planes flew, but also the airphones that were on the aircraft, and D, the eyewitnesses who saw the planes hit, including many who saw the impact at the Pentagon. Barbara Olson called her husband twice to alert him to Flight 77's path and its intended target. 12 people made calls from Flight 93, including Tom Burnett, who called his wife 3 times. Allowing for the time in which radar and the black boxes could track the aircraft, there was no time to land even one of them and deplane people, who had to then be whisked off mysteriously without ever again contacting anyone. An operation that, according to the conspiracists, had to be carried out with absolutely no flaw or leaks. Take off again and then acquire the target. The fact that the airplanes are clearly the same ones that took off less than an hour earlier and can be identified as such, not only by wreckage but by, in some cases, photos taken just before impact, has not been explained by the kook lobby. Moreover, no one can explain why the very same hijackers who had trained to conduct exactly such an operation would have mysteriously boarded 4 planes that just happened to hit the targets they trained to strike, nor why Osama bin Laden would take credit for an operation that he and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed both admitted to planning. Neither Charlie Sheen nor Rosie O'Donnell can explain why there was a struggle on Flight 93 with the very Muslims who were identified as boarding earlier. In short, there is a good reason we have terms like kook, wacko, and tinfoil hat crowd. The fact that some conspiracists actually hold respectable jobs or appear normal under other circumstances should not conceal the fact that they are on one side, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Fire Protection Association, Underwriters Laboratory, several prominent universities, the 9/11 Commission, plus virtually every agency within the government that has in any way examined the evidence are on the other side. It's also not surprising that many of the same conspiracy theorists are still searching for the alien bodies at Roswell. End quote. Or that's the end of that one. I think he is way, 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 way off the mark on that one, to be honest. I think had he been writing this 15 years later, he might have a completely different take on it. Because more stuff's come out since then that just convinces me more and more all the time that it may not have been 100% our government, but it was certainly not totally just a bunch of Muslims that got box cutters onto planes. Anyway, that's enough of that. We'll end it there and see who's around to... Ooh, The Expanse, a Telltale series. I've been thinking about buying that. I want to go, so let's go check that out. How about? And I will see you over there.
Ray, how's everything going?